I'm Kristen Thornton-De, and I'm here today to talk to you about some books that I think would be great additions to your music classes, especially with 7th to 10th graders. Some of these are more for the older kids, but definitely they're appropriate for those grade levels. So the first one that I want to talk about is more blues related. All of the books are sort of a combination of blues and jazz related. But the first one is Black Cat Bone, and it's by J. Patrick Lewis, and the illustrations are by Gary Kelly. This one in particular I think will really interest your students, particularly because it's about the blues legend Robert Johnson, and he's not, when we talk about legends in terms of music, we're generally talking about how, great of musicians that they are. But the thing with Robert Johnson is he was an amazing, phenomenal musician, but he was also a legend in the fact that there's so much myth around his whole story. So this book is really a biography of Robert Johnson, and it's told through poems by Lewis, but also it uses lyrics from some of the songs that Robert Johnson wrote. And so it's just a really interesting look into his life, and it's all in chronological order, so that's really great. And I guess we'll start with this illustration that's on the front, but this is probably one of my favorites inside the book, because the thing about Robert Johnson is, when you think about how this myth around Robert Johnson has come to exist, it can be worrisome, especially because he's an African American musician, because often in the history of blues, a lot of the white civilized musicians, especially in terms of classical music, they looked at blues and they were perplexed by it, and often because they found it as, a more wild music, and they were looking at how black musicians were sort of, again, these like savage beings, which obviously we think is ridiculous now, at least most of us do. But the problem with the story of Robert Johnson is I think sometimes we worry that because of the way that his story's been told, that it might overlook his music. But the great thing about this is that it doesn't do that. It really gives a personal story about him, but it also gives you details about just what a great musician he was, and a look into some of that myth and how it began. So, and also there's the fact that Robert Johnson sort of played into that myth himself, because my favorite page in the book is talking about at the crossroad, highways 61 and 49. And so it splits up that illustration on the front, which is great. And you turn it so you see this is supposed to be Robert Johnson with the black cat and half of the guitar. And then you turn it to the next page, and this is the devil with the serpent and the other half of the guitar. Because the legend of Robert Johnson is that supposedly he went to the crossroads and sold his soul to the devil for his talent in music. So I think that's a really interesting way that the illustrator has shown that. And so the first page is a poem written by Lewis, and then the second page is actually lyrics from Robert Johnson. And these lyrics are from Crossroads Blues, and so he sort of writes about that whole story that people have made up about him, at least, about how he sold his soul. And so he plays into that legend a lot, and this is one of his more famous songs, but it's a great way to look at that legend. And so there are other interesting details that play into that. We also get a look at his death, and how after his death even, we see a bit of the legend of that coming about. And then, in terms of the title, Black Cat Bone, it's about a lucky charm in the African American tradition of hoodoo. So a lot of practitioners believed that black cats were lucky, and that they had at least one bone in their body that was a lucky charm. So that's an interesting fact. And I think also this would be great for music classes because when paired with Robert Johnson's recordings, it would do a great job. So you can either play those for the certain pages or whatever you think works best. But I think this would work well having your students read this, or even just suggesting it to them if they're interested in blues or maybe Robert Johnson, or suggesting it to them for a project. So that's Black Cat Bone. I really, really enjoyed this one. I also have one about Troy Andrews, aka Trombone Shorty. This one is great. It's a Coretta Scott King Award winner, and it's also a Caldecott Honor recipient. This one in particular is Troy Andrews. He's the author, so he's writing sort of his own biography, and it's illustrated by the Caldecott Honor winner Brian Collar. And this one is interesting because it combines illustrations with, on one particular page, it has a picture of Troy Andrews when he was younger, and so it's a really interesting combination of, it's a collage-like, and so the illustrations are really, really captivating. And one of the best parts about this book that I think will really interest your students is it tells how when Troy Andrews was very young, I believe he was only 4, he went to a music festival in New Orleans and he saw Bo Diddley, the famous guitarist. He saw him playing and he brought along his huge trombone, and he was playing along in the audience, and Bo Diddley heard him and he's like, "Who's that? Who's that playing?" And he actually brought Troy Andrews up on stage. And so there's a page that illustrates that. It shows him out in the audience, and then it shows Bo Diddley bringing him up on stage. And then at the end, where you get the notes from Troy Andrews, we have an actual picture of Bo Diddley with Troy Andrews. So that's really great and cool. And then another one, this one is going back to blues. This one's by Walter Dean Myers, and it's illustrated by Christopher Myers. And this one, the illustrations are more subdued, so it might not be great for all of your students because it's not as captivating because the colors are all darker. They're not bright colors. So the visuals are very beautiful, but like I said, they're more subdued. And the great thing about this one is it takes lyrics from different blues songs and it pairs them with illustrations. And so this one is both, you know, a tribute to the music, but also a tribute to how the music showed the journey of civil rights. And it's also sort of a bit of a chronological look at that. And this one even has a timeline at the end. So, but one page in particular that I found really interesting was the lyrics are from Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. And then the image that we have is Yesterday a Man Was Lynched, and it's about the march where they're talking about the lynchings. So this one was really moving. It's very historical. It's great because it also has, like I said, that timeline at the back, so the history of that is really great. And this is another one, just like Black Cat Bone, where if in their other classes your students are looking at poetry, they'll have a chance to sort of look over the way certain lyrics and also poems are written. So it's not just great for music, but it's good for sort of English language arts as well. So that one's really great. And then lastly, I have Ellington Was Not a Street by Entozaki Shenge, and this one was illustrated by Kadir Nelson. And this one, it's more historical than musical, but the interesting about it is obviously it mentions Duke Ellington in the title, and what it is it pairs lines from Shenge's poem Mood Indigo, which is obviously a tribute to the piece by Duke Ellington. It pairs lines from that with illustrations from Shenge's childhood, because her father interacted with a lot of figures from the civil rights movement, and a lot of them were musicians. You know, there's one page that features W.B. Du Bois coming to her house, but one of the first pages features Paul Robeson, the famous bass singer. So he's coming into her house, and there she is when she's little. And so it's showing these important figures in that movement and in the history of black music, but it's also, you know, sort of taking a personal look at that and seeing how this little girl saw the happenings and the discussions between her father and all of these, you know, really important figures in history. So this is another great one, history-wise. And this one in particular, I just love the illustrations. They really are so colorful and just, they're so well detailed, you know, like, it's beautiful. So that's about it. I really think that your students will enjoy these, whether they're reading it in their free time, or reading it for your class, or doing it for, you know, a project. So I really hope that you take these into consideration, because I think they're all great options. So thanks for your time today. Bye!